bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everyone, to Society and the State. This is episode 88. We are talking about the elephant in the room, the biggest problem that we need to tackle, and that is our national debt. Joined today by Anthony Randazzo from the Reason Foundation, who has written prolifically about this. So we're going to dig in deep and try and understand this problem. Anthony, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
So, we passed $21 trillion now. The first question I want to ask is a rather simple one, and that is, has this number become so large as to be incomprehensible? And in your outreach and research efforts, do you find that this number is like too big? What are your thoughts on, are there substantive differences between 5 trillion and 21 trillion, or is there really any problem that becomes more exacerbated the bigger that we get?
Well, certainly the number is too big, just in general. But yes, I would say that 21 trillion is almost impossible for the human mind to really process exactly what that means. And so what really is the difference between 5 trillion and 21 trillion? In the course of my career, I've lost track of how many times the debt has doubled, and then doubled again, and then doubled again. And so at a certain point, when we're sitting back saying, oh my gosh, $5 trillion in national debt it's awful, it's terrible, it's bad for the economy, and then it grows to over 20 trillion, the story is the same. Right. It's just exponentially worse. And I think if you're sitting back in the general public and you're being told 5 trillion is bad, and then you're told a few years later it's grown to over 20 trillion and the world hasn't ended, it's probably difficult not to at some level think that there's some Chicken Little fears going on, and that maybe the people that have been warning, such as us, about the problems of the national debt are overstating the fears. That's
a really interesting point to bring up. Maybe the issue itself contributes to this numbing of public interest and concern. I'm going to link to an article that you wrote a couple years ago on our show notes page, which I'll announce later for our listeners. And in this article, you talk about the problem, but you cite that in the 2012 election, Gallup did this poll, and 12% of respondents said that the federal budget was the nation's most pressing problem. And yet 4 years later, May 2016, that number had declined to 3%, just 3% of respondents saying that the federal budget, this massive, $20 trillion plus national debt was the big problem. You go to U.S. Debt Clock, right, and they have a mobile app now. You can watch these numbers just scroll up. So what you say is very interesting to me, that perhaps we have this Chicken Little thing that, look, stock market's going up, my job's doing fine, things are going great. And so what's the real problem? Maybe help us understand why that perspective is wrong. Why do you continue to advocate that this is a problem, notwithstanding people maybe having that Chicken Little reaction to what you're preaching?
Sure. So at one level, it's helpful to touch on psychology. There's a very basic principle known as representative bias. The things that are front and center tend to be front and center of mind. That's why after, say, a terrorist attack, people tend to be more concerned about ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and then a few years after a terrorist attack, they're not as concerned. 2012, the financial crisis was much more front and center than, say, 2016. And so just economic issues in general are going to inspire more concern. And so since maybe it's difficult for the general public to really differentiate between the debt, the deficit, and global economic or national economic trends, just being concerned about markets may lead someone to be concerned about debt. But as you shift away from there being any sort of catastrophic financial issue, you don't have that sort of near-term representative fear. You don't see it in the paper every day, and it's difficult to really work up the need to be concerned. Whereas I tend to look at this from a long-term perspective, and as well as a what are we not seeing and what are we not getting. There are the size of the national debt creates pressure combined with the rest of global debt on markets, on interest rates, on the ability for the American public to save because interest rates are so low, on tax policy. So if you try to take a long-term view and you don't just look at the near term, it's a lot easier to get scared than if you're only looking at the near-term stuff.
Now, Anthony, maybe break it down for the listener, because as you say, during your career, you've seen the national debt double. I think you said twice, but certainly it is substantially increased. To what do you attribute that? What are the causes that are leading to the national debt just exploding by trillions in recent years and decades?
There's a couple of causes. One of the worst of which is just exponential growth in the debt because of the deficits that were added during the Bush administration and then the Obama administration, and then just the interest on the debt outstripping what the dollars that we're throwing in to pay for it. And one of the things actually holding down the debt at some level is the Federal Reserve, which is keeping interest rates low, which in turn means that at the very least the cost of borrowing has been kept lower, and that has prevented the debt from growing even more. The downside effect of that is that in low interest rates mean low savings rates. And so anybody with a checking account that gets no interest, or a savings account that maybe, if you're lucky, gets 1% interest, if less, you can't find money market accounts or CDs to keep your money safe for 6 months to a year that get you any kind of real interest. Well, that's because interest rates are being kept low.
Yeah.
And why are interest rates being kept low? Because in part, not the only reason, but in part, to help manage the larger national debt.
Now, as you say, there's kind of this chicken little psychological effect of representative bias, where people might not care as much about the things that are not, directly in front of them. So we've got this big number. It's incomprehensible almost. And things seem to be going fine for many people, notwithstanding the debt increasing. And yet, at some point, something has to happen to correct this. And so if do you have put on your little, prognostication cap here? Like at one point, not to predict the time necessarily, but what are the potential consequences and outcomes here? Is it insolvency? Is it a bank run? Is it hyperinflation? For a country that amasses this amount of debt, what are the potential consequences that might be facing us in, whether years or decades? What are potential outcomes that might result from having a debt so high?
So I have to admit that I'm guilty of probably a ineffective way of trying to talk about this in the past, that I think a lot of my colleagues that do economic writing sort of stumble into. And we talk about things like bankruptcy is coming, insolvency is coming. And the problem with that, as I've sort of come to maybe embrace, is that we don't know what that looks like. We have no idea what the bankruptcy of the United States could look like. We don't even know what state bankruptcy looks like. There's no part of the bankruptcy code to be able to handle the problems of California, Illinois, or New Jersey, much less the U.S. government. And the only thing we could possibly draw up to look like insolvency would be if people stopped lending to the United States government.
Yeah.
And without any conceptual universe in which that happens, in theory, the debt could just keep going up as long as the government can continue to borrow. What we see in practice and sort of public policy analysis and political analysis is that what drives action is crisis. And since something like the federal debt going up is a really esoteric crisis, I could argue that the last 10 years of it being impossible for Americans to save effectively because interest rates have been so low constitutes a fiscal crisis. Mm-hmm. But it certainly isn't the same thing as, say, the Social Security Administration announcing that the trust fund has run out of cash and they're cutting all pension checks by a third, which is theoretically something that could happen in the next 20 years without changes to the Social Security Trust Fund. That kind of crisis could encourage action. But outside of some massive mitigating force or a political movement, somewhat like what the Tea Party kind of came close to in putting a lot of people into Congress all at one time on a similar agenda, it does seem, for you put your prognosticator cap on, difficult to really draw up what that scenario looks like to deal with this, especially given how ineffective the Tea Party movement ultimately was in addressing the debt.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And as you say, crisis precedes action or precipitates action. But would you not also agree that crisis can lead to I don't know if inaction is the right way, but a lack of confidence, where if we can perpetuate the debt because people will continue to finance that, other countries will continue to loan us money, could it not be, and would you agree that a crisis such as you say the Social Security Administration making that type of announcement might lead to a lack of investor confidence and therefore accelerate perhaps the actions, the potential hyperinflation or bank runs or what have you, when investors see that signal worldwide, they see that signal of a crisis, and then things begin to precipitate. Is that a worry? Is that a concern?
It's certainly plausible. If we look at something like the European Union's attempt to deal with crises in Spain, Italy, and Greece, the ways in which elected officials and leaders in investment circles will try to get together to collaborate on ways to avoid potential crises is just as strong of a motivating force as investors looking to make money on those particular events and make money on volatility and not participate, which can then which can in its own way perpetuate crises. We can see both kinds of activities happening. So I'd say it's certainly plausible what you outlined.
That's interesting. Tell me, to what degree do the entitlements affect the debt, right? So a lot of people here, just generally speaking, that we have massive entitlements, and you point out Social Security. We have in your article, you point out from a demographic standpoint, federal finances are heavily impacted by the aging of the baby boomers. And so looking forward in the years and decades to come, as we have a population that is increasingly healthy and living longer and therefore more financially dependent upon the system, how does that contribute to this overall debt issue?
Well, this is going to sound maybe a little bit ironic, but I'm much less concerned about Social Security than I am Medicare. So to start with, if you look at what makes up the debt held by the public, Medicare is almost 3 times what Social Security, in terms of that particular share, the Medicare liability for, if we look at government debt, including off-balance sheet debt. So not just the debt held by the public, but all the liabilities that are outstanding that are theoretically unfunded. Social Security is also something that technically is fairly easy to address, in that you can always theoretically change the retirement age or means test the benefits over time. Not that that's politically easy, but it's a technically easy problem to solve, whereas Medicare costs are completely driven by the outside influence of the cost of healthcare in general and the cost of prescription drugs, which are continuously on the rise despite a lot of efforts and energy to focus in on them. So as we talk about people living longer and how that might affect the debt, I think the number one area to focus on in that context is how that's going to influence Medicare and Medicare benefits.
So I want to keep this episode short because I find that when I talk to people about this issue, it becomes so overwhelming. So we're just going to give people a little teaser. We'll link to them on the show notes page where they can read more if they want to try and wrap their heads around this massive problem that most people probably feel they can do literally nothing about. But that's my final question for you is what is the proposed solution? What needs to happen? What needs to change in order to begin to correct this? it just a reduction in spending? Is it somehow manufacturing the political will to, as you say, do means testing or raise the age or try and lower costs of prescription drugs? What are kind of the recommended solutions in your mind to try and tackle this big problem?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. It's trying to address the rational ignorance of voters. Most voters, it's in their best interest to not pay attention to this issue and to focus on other things because there is very little that they can do about it. So rational ignorance is a incredibly powerful force in opposition to this. And as long as there is a lack of real understanding around why this is important, politicians also rationally will not put forward realistic solutions. Another side of this is not being swayed by arguments such as, if we could only reduce spending a little bit, or if we could clean up fraud, waste, and abuse, that might have a positive effect. Technically, it would have a positive effect, but we could eliminate all waste, fraud, and abuse and almost all of the discretionary spending of the federal government, and that in itself is not going to solve the problem, just given the weight of entitlements. So I think sort of the lasting point is if we want to be serious about addressing the national debt and the deficit, it has to be an all of the above sort of a list that you just ran through, but it principally needs to focus on how do we address the challenge of entitlements, entitlement spending, entitlement programs, and do so in a way in which we continue to be compassionate and focused on this as a country, and not just try and treat those programs as a esoteric beast that's coming to get us, because that in and of itself winds up creating political challenges that are not helpful for solving the problem.
Anthony Randazzo, Senior Fellow at Reason Foundation, helping us whet our appetite or lack thereof for such a weighty, big issue. Thanks for taking a few minutes and joining us today.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.